The next morning was long and tiresome. Timo pondered the meaning of his dream the night before, but kept it to himself. He felt as though he was being called back into the mountain, but that would be silly and dangerous. The western way continued to wind through the mountains. It was the longest way out from the fairies' kingdom, but the safest. They had used up the torches they had been given by the fairies the evening before, and were now using Timo's sap-dipped rags from his emergency survival kit. When Timo had produced these, Erba had laughed a good while, shaking his head in amazement. These burnt brighter and much longer than the oil torches of the fairies, which Timo noticed and was quite proud of. They still had quite a ways to go before reaching the western gate of the mountain. The children were worried about their mother and how she would be feeling, and Erba tried keeping them distracted with tales from his own adventures with the fairies, but it helped little. As midday arrived, or what they guessed was midday, they came to a large cave with its own stalagmites and stalactites. It reminded them of the king's chamber, but far less magnificent. They made another small fire with the remaining sticks and laid down. "Not too long now," said Erba, putting out the torch to save it. They had 5 rags left to make more, plenty for the rest of the journey. "We should reach the door within a few hours, but I can't go any further. You two have shown your strength today." He lay down and fell asleep. Jonathan was next to fall asleep, but Timo stayed awake, staring into the fire, his thoughts full of his dreams and the stories of his uncle. What was down the passageway? Eventually, he fell asleep. In his dream, he found himself in the king's throne room again. Once again, the doorway called to him from where a statue stood in the king's real chamber. Once again, he followed the stairs down into the mountain, and once again found the great light. This time, it was even brighter, and as he reached the source of the light, he found himself standing in front of a small well. He awoke. He looked at his uncle and brother, who were fast asleep. The fire had only burned a little. He must have only just fallen asleep. But he knew what he needed to do, or at least felt as though he needed to do. He must find that passage and see the light. He reckoned it was calling to him for a reason. Perhaps he was the child of man. At the very least, he was a child of a man. Without thinking too much, he stood up and quietly put his bag on his back. His mind was made. Back to the fairy halls. He laid on the ground 2 of his sap-soaked torch rags so his uncle and brother could safely make the rest of the journey out of the mountain. He softly tiptoed to the path leading out of the mountain and left on the ground a piece of chewed flower gum. Hopefully his uncle would guess he had ventured further out of the mountain and not back into it. He reckoned they had been walking for about 8 hours since leaving the fairy halls. If his uncle kept sleeping a while and guessed wrong about Timo's direction, he may reach the halls before his uncle caught up. If he was caught, he would be in a lot of trouble. Timo then crept around his sleeping uncle and brother, and with a brief glance over his shoulder, he stole into the dark passage that led back into the fairy halls. He felt his way for a while in the dark before taking out a torch and lighting it with his flint and steel. Then, with all the energy he could muster, he picked up his pace to a light run. Timo was very fit but could not run for 8 hours without rest, but he would need a good head start, a great deal of pace, and a pinch of luck if he wished to outrun his uncle. After some time, Timo could not run any further and slowed to a walk. He took out some scraps of bread he still had and ate on the move. When he felt rested enough, he started jogging again. The path seemed to fly by and Timo lost track of time. His legs were sore, but his heart was set on his journey. He tried not to think about what he was doing. It only made him want to turn back. He ran on. When his uncle woke about an hour later and noticed Timo had gone, he quickly woke Jonathan and they scoured the cave, calling out Timo's name without any reply. Erba knew that he had not been captured by the trolls, as they could not have reached them by then, and why take only Timo when all three had been sleeping? For some unknown reason, Timo must have left on his own. But in what direction? Surely Timo would not be returning back into the mountain. "He left us 2 torch rags," said Jonathan, holding up the sap-soaked cloths. "He must have left it so we could follow him." Erba did not respond. Soon the flower gum was found on the ground, and Erba guessed that Timo had ventured further out of the mountain. Jonathan was not so sure, but went along with his uncle. They slowly followed the path leading westwards, making sure they didn't miss any signs that Timo had been down that way. After an hour of walking, they came to another wider cave, and an underground stream flowed ever so slowly through. The ground here was different. Not the solid rock of the mountain, but a light sand, piled by the stream over countless years of its flowing. In the sandy floor, they found tracks of fairies who had passed through over many years, but they were old tracks. No sign was found that a young boy with small feet had walked through this part of the tunnel. Erba's heart sank. Why would Timo be turning back into the mountain? I should not have told him about the prophecy. He picked up Jonathan, placed him on his shoulders, and started running back from where they came. Jonathan was silent and could see the fear in his uncle's eyes. After a while, Jonathan had to walk as the ceiling of the tunnel was too low to allow him to be carried. Then their first torch went out. One left. Erba quickly lit the last torch left by Timo, and they hurried along the path. After a short while, they arrived back at their campsite and continued further down the tunnel. Still no sign of Timo. Jonathan could run faster than Timo, but not as fast as his uncle. But Erba would not leave Jonathan behind in the dark to catch up quicker. They ran on, and when Jonathan tired, Erba picked him up, placed him on his back, and ran further, but now slower. Then, just as they were feeling as though they were making progress, the final torch went out. They were in complete darkness. Luckily for them, they knew that the tunnel did not part and continued on relatively straight until it reached the fairies' halls. But all they could do now was walk slowly forward, using the tunnel walls to guide them. They would no longer catch Timo before he reached the fairy halls. They could only hope that the trolls had not broken through already, and in the light of the halls they could find Timo and get some head start on the trolls who would inevitably break through. Meanwhile, Timo pressed on, his legs burning from the fast pace he was keeping. Sometimes he ran, sometimes he walked, but he never fully stopped. Eventually he could go no further without a rest. He sat down and unwillingly fell asleep. Once again he dreamt of the king's chamber and the tunnels of light. He was awoken by the terrible sound of the trolls' battering rams, still trying to break through the strong stone mountain gates. He was getting closer, and after his latest dream, his heart more adamant than ever on his mission. Standing up, he lit his last torch and started to run. The rest had done him good, and he was able to move at a good pace. The path started to wind around the familiar streams of gold and silver, and Timo thought that he recognized some of the formations on either side. Eventually, though, his torch was exhausted, but instead of finding himself in darkness, as his uncle and brother had found themselves, he instead saw a glow coming from the path ahead. He had made it back to the fairy halls.